Hello and welcome to Vigilance Biology. This is Jagrati Singh, and today we are going to start a new topic, which is animal tissues. So, we already know that in plants, similar cells they group together and become specialized to perform different functions or particular function, right? Exactly इसी तरह animals में भी cells एक साथ group form करके they form animal tissues, they become specialized. Okay, but before we study the different types of animal tissue, let us just connect this topic with some activities that we perform every day. So the first activity which we can do right now is blinking our eyes. Okay, so just try to blink your eyes quickly for a few seconds. What happened? Your eyelids moved repeatedly, right? So some tissues in our body must help produce this movement. Now the question is, which tissue helps in movement? Is movement possible without specialized cells? No, right? Muscular tissues, we know that muscular tissues, they help in movement. So these muscular tissue is specialized for contraction and relaxation of which enables different types of movement in our body, right? Now the second activity which we can do is clenching and opening your fist, right? So just make a tight fist, hold it for a few seconds, and then just open it. You can see that the muscles of your hand, they are contracting and then they are relaxing to produce this movement. Okay, so again, this activity makes us think about muscular tissues, right, which is specialized for movement. Now the next activity which we can do is taking a deep breath. Okay, so when you breathe in, the air enters your lungs, right? So what happens actually is oxygen from the air has to pass into the blood, right? So now just think about this question. Which tissue is actually allowing the oxygen to enter the blood? Okay. So obviously there are specialized, tissues which are present in the lining of the lungs, which are epithelial tissue. So they contain a very thin epithelial tissue which allows a rapid exchange of gases. Okay. Now another activity which we can do is touching something very warm or cold. This is like something which we do in our everyday life, right? So just if you touch something warm or cold, what happens? How did you know whether it was warm or cold? So we actually sensed it through our sensory receptors, okay? Or you can call nervous system. So specialized cells, they help us to detect a different sensation. If we will study about epithelial tissue, there are also some specialized receptor cells which are involved in sensory functions such as smell or, such as taste, sound, or even balance as well. So from these activity, what we observed, we can see that different tissues, they perform different function. Okay. Now just think about one more question. Which tissue holds our body together so that the skin does not simply fall off? Now again, different tissues, they work together, right? To provide support, protection, and connection between different parts of the body. So therefore, animal tissues, they show a great diversity of structure and function. Okay, so different tissues, they are specifically adapted to perform different functions. Okay, so this is a very important idea for this chapter to understand that structure is actually related to function. Uh, like, in other words, we can say that the structure of a tissue is suited, the structure of the tissue is, suited to the particular function it performs. Okay. For example, if we talk about a tissue which has to allow rapid diffusion of gases, so its cells need to be very thin. Why it needs to be very thin? So that if a tissue has to protect, right, it needs to be very thin so that, the rapid diffusion of gases can occur, right? Now, another example, if we take, there's any tissue which has to protect the body from injury. So it needs a stronger and more protective arrangement of cells, right? So let us just try to explore how the different kinds of tissues of like animal tissues they are, and how each tissue they perform a specific function. Okay, so the first one is epithelial tissue. So we'll be studying about the structure and function of epithelial tissues. Okay, yeah. So our first type of animal tissue is epithelial tissue, and starting with what is epithelial tissue? So epithelial tissue, it forms the outer covering of the body, such as skin. Okay, but it is not just restricted only to outside of the body. It also lines many internal organs, such as like mouth, lungs, blood vessels, and intestine. Okay, so whenever we talk about epithelial tissue, remember two major ideas. First is covering, and second is lining. Okay, why we are saying that? Because it covers the outside of body, and along with that, it lines many structures inside the body. Structures inside the body. Okay. So now if we talk about the structure of epithelial tissue, iska structure, it is made up of closely packed cells. There's very little space between the cells, but cells इतने closely packed होते हैं because you can just think about like your skin. Okay, so the skin is exposed to the outside environment, right? Now, if there were large gaps between its cells, germs and harmful substances, they can, easily they can enter, right? So therefore, the cells are closely packed so that it can prevent the entry of germs and reduce water loss, also help in absorption, secretion, and movement of substances. Okay, it also helps in like in specialized forms, they perform sensory functions as well. Okay, so different epithelial tissues, they have different structures, they are adapted for different function. Okay, so now we have a table here in which we can see the characteristics of functionally and structurally different types of epithelial tissues. Okay, so I would suggest this table ko simply mug up mat karna, because instead just try to understand the connection between function. Try to understand the connection between function, structure, and location. Okay. Now, हर एपिथेलियल टिश्यू का स्ट्रक्चर उसके फंक्शन के अकॉर्डिंग अडेप्टेड होता है. ओके, सो इफ वी टॉक अबाउट द फर्स्ट फंक्शन विच इज एक्सचेंज. So exchange means the movement of substances such as rapid diffusion of liquids and gases. Okay, so these liquids and gases, they move from one place to another. They move these substances, they move from one place to another. Now if we talk about the structure, what type of structure would be useful if substances have to pass very quickly through the tissue? It should be thin structure, right? So that it can easily pass, right? So therefore, the epithelial tissue, they consist of a single layer of thin or flat cells. Okay, these epithelial tissue, they consist of single layer of thin or flat cells because the cells are very thin and arranged in a single layer. Okay, the cells are very thin and they are arranged in a very single layer so that substances can diffuse rapidly across. Okay. Now, if we talk about the location, this type of epithelial tissue is found in lining of blood vessels and lungs. Okay. So, in the lungs, we know gases, they need to be exchanged efficiently, right? So, oxygen, it needs to move into the blood, while carbon dioxide needs to move out. Now, there's a thin layer of cells which is suitable for rapid diffusion. Okay, so always remember, whenever we talk about, this function, you can remember like exchange is done because of the presence of single thin layer having flat cells so that the gases can diffuse easily, right? And it is present in blood vessels and lungs. Okay. Now talking about another function, which is protection. So these epithelial tissue, they protect the underlying tissues from mechanical injury, friction, and entry of microscopes. Okay, microbes, sorry. So suppose if something has to protect the body from, repeated friction and injury, would a single layer always be enough? No, right? So therefore, the tissue has so many layers, okay? So that the outer cells are flat and they are tightly packed as well, okay? And what about the location? If we talk about the location, it is present in skin, mouth, and esophagus, okay? Now, the question is, why is the structure suitable? So we know that our skin, it faces so much mechanical stress and possible injury as well, right? So the mouth and esophagus also experience friction as food moves through them. Therefore, having many layers of cells will provide better protection. Okay. Now let's just talk about the third function, which is secretion. Okay. So secretion means the production and release of substances. So these epithelial tissue, they are involved in producing and releasing substances such as mucus, enzymes, hormones, sweat, and saliva. Okay. So if we talk about the structure and just think about it, that if a cell has to produce and release a particular substance, it needs to be specialized for that job, right? So therefore, these are specialized cells for producing and releasing substances. Okay. Now, the cells may be cuboidal or columnar in shape. It, depends on the structure, right? Now, where these are actually found, they are found in salivary gland, sweat glands, and stomach lining. Okay. For example, salivary gland produces saliva, right? Sweat gland, it produces sweat. Therefore, these epithelial cells, they are associated with these structures, are specialized for certain secretions. Okay. Now, talking about the fourth function, which is sensory function. So, we have epithelial tissue with sensory function, and these tissue, they are involved in detecting the sensations. What kind of sensation? That can be any kind of smell, sound, taste, or even balance. Okay. Because these tissue, they have to receive or detect, stimuli, right? So they contain specialized receptor cells. Now, these receptor cells, they have hair-like structures, which are called as cilia. Okay, so what are these cilia? Cilia are tiny hair-like structures which are present on the cells. Okay. Now, the question is, where these specialized epithelial cells are found? So these are found in nostrils, taste buds, and inner ear. Okay. So let's just think of one example. When you smell food, so there are certain specialized structures, like, there are specialized receptor cells in the nose which detects the chemicals which are associated with the smell. Okay. So when you taste something, the receptor cells in the taste buds help to detect the taste. Now, if we talk about the inner ear, so there in the inner ear as well, there are certain structures which are involved in hearing and balance. Okay. So you can just remember the sensory function, like there are certain specialized receptor cells with hair-like cilia, and they are present in nostrils, taste buds, inner ear. Okay. Now, the last function is absorption, okay, which is also very important. So this absorption means basically uptake of, substances such as nutrients and water. Now, the question is, where does a large amount of nutrient absorption take place? We know this, that is small intestine, right? So, the epithelial tissue involved in absorption of a single layer of tall pillar-like cells. You know, these cells, they are often associated with hair-like structures. Okay. So the structure is therefore suited for efficient uptake of nutrients and water. Right. Now, if we talk about the location of the cells, these tissues are found in the lining of small intestine, right? So, when the food, like the food that has been digested, it contains nutrients in it, right? Those nutrients need to be absorbed into the body, right? So therefore, the lining of the small intestine is specially adapted for a efficient absorption. Okay. So we have studied, how like the epithelial cells, they perform different types of functions, and based on different types of function, they have specialized structure as well, and they are having specialized location as well. Okay. So that's about the epithelial tissue.